Ever since the controversial release of the Creative Cloud in 2013, Adobe has been regarded as one of the greediest companies in the world. With over 30 million users trapped in an endless cycle of payments, the Federal Trade Commission has accused the American giant of engaging in deceptive subscription practices and manipulative retention tactics. Alongside millions of angry creatives, they have exposed an abusive business model where profits come first and customers second.
The Federal Trade Commission is accusing software company Adobe of deceiving its customers.
They make subscriptions easy to buy, but extremely difficult to cancel.
However, what if I told you that there was once a time when the sentiment surrounding Adobe was the complete opposite? A time, 40 years ago, when two creative visionaries, John Warnock and Charles Jesk, built a business that thrived by valuing its customers and creating the best possible products.
An engineer, a scientist, dreams about coming up with something that millions of people will find valuable and use. That's what drives us.
This is a product that we are very, very excited about. And it has a lot of capabilities that you won't find in other programs.
From its humble beginnings inside Xerox PARC to becoming the gold standard of creative software, the story of Adobe's founders inspired decades of innovation and customer loyalty, even after they were forced to step down from office.
Adobe's dominance of the creative software market has made it one of America's most valuable tech companies.
The goal for us is to be able to deliver rapid, ongoing innovation.
Yet the question remains, how did a company built on the premise of creative freedom and supporting its community become the symbol of corporate greed and monopolistic control it is today?
Adobe are kinda evil.
I have severed all ties with Adobe.
In other words, when exactly did things go wrong for Adobe?
We call these machines computers.
It is 1978 and the first computing revolution is beginning to stir across Silicon Valley. Ever since the release of the first personal computer in 1975, the tech industry has been experiencing one of the most explosive gold rushes since the discovery of oil in 1859.
I sent a message to my doctor asking for a repeat prescription. He's left the prescription for me in the chemist.
Similar to the current AI craze, the gap between imagination and creation was shrinking, and the next big breakthrough could come from any startup or business. Among the boldest technology research centers of the era, Xerox PARC stood out as the most revolutionary. Contrary to Adobe today, its mission wasn't to maximize profits, but to create groundbreaking computer innovations that shaped the future regardless of the cost. Backed by its parent company, the leader in office printing systems for businesses, Xerox's computer science division was specifically tasked with creating digital products that made office work faster, easier, and more connected. Leading a team of 30 researchers was Charles Jesk, a 39-year-old former math professor from Ohio with a PhD in computer science. After spending years working on advanced programming languages at Xerox, his excellent leadership skills led to his promotion to head of the Imaging Sciences Laboratory. Yet even though he was one of the most respected minds in the lab, the pace of innovations and technological breakthroughs in the late 1970s was too complex for him to do all the leadership work on his own. He decided to personally hire John Warnock, a 37-year-old computer scientist from Evans and Sutherland, to be his right-hand man and co-lead the project.
I called him up, I said, let's have lunch. He had a beard, I had a beard, still married to the same woman he married originally, so was I. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. I had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And we both refereed soccer, which closed the deal.
As soon as John Warnock joined the lab, it was clear that he had the potential to deliver the value that both Xerox and Jesk were looking for. During his time at his former company, John developed a new approach to how computers could handle visuals, making it possible for text and images to appear the same way they did digitally, but on paper. Although this may now sound somewhat obvious, in the late 1970s, the concept of printing and desktop publishing wasn't precisely what it is today. Instead of having personalized digital printers capable of replicating exactly what appears on a digital screen, laser printers at the time were too limited to handle complex graphics, scalable fonts, or consistent page layouts. Not only that, but these printers cost a whopping $295,000, meaning that only large corporations and government agencies could afford to have one at their offices. However, in a world where digital publishing had the potential to evolve exponentially, John Warnock's vision was to create software that would allow printers to replicate exactly what was displayed on a digital screen. Now working on it at the Images Science Lab at Park, Jesch took his vision a step further, envisioning a world where laser printers would become more affordable and where all employees could print high-quality documents from the comfort of their desk. In August 1982, 3 years after the project began, Warnock and Jesch presented their final product to their supervisor, Bob Sproul, during a formal internal review at a technical briefing at Xerox PARC. The duo had named their product Interpress, a page description language designed to make printed pages look exactly the same on screen. As soon as Bob saw the demo version, his first reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Like the rest of the technical team, he told the duo that Interpress was an impressive technology, and he even agreed to buy it internally for the rest of Xerox Corporation. However, when Warnock asked whether they could start selling the product commercially, the answer to his question completely changed the course of his and Jesch's careers.
But we sold it inside of Xerox, and they said, okay, this is the standard. We said, well, if it's a standard, we ought to announce it to the world so that the world can implement it. They said, no, you're not going to do that until all of our printers can run it. I thought to myself, and Chuck Todd thought to himself, that's never going to happen. And I don't know what he said in his interview.
That's what he said. Yeah.
Never going to happen.
Essentially, while Xerox liked the idea, they didn't think it was urgent enough to devote the time and resources it required. They couldn't imagine a near future where every desk would have its own printer. Nor did they believe that a page description language could gain any sort of real traction in the short term. For Warnock and Jesch, this dismissal meant years of hard work and perseverance reduced to a footnote.
So we were depressed. I went into his office and I said, we can live in the world's greatest sandbox for the rest of our life, or we can do something about it.
Days after Xerox directors rejected the commercial launch of Interpress, John Warnock communicated his disappointment to his former thesis advisor, Dave Evans, the founder of Evans & Sutherland. Unlike Bob Sproul, he was aligned with Jesch and Warnock's vision of a future where computing was tightly intertwined with personal digital publishing. As a result, he introduced John and Charles to Bill Hambrecht, a well-known investment banker and the founder of one of the first venture capital firms in San Francisco, Hambrecht and Quist. After a long pitch, Bill was intrigued by their idea and was willing to support the duo with a $2.5 million investment under one simple condition. Both of them had to quit their jobs and commit to the project full-time.
Turns out, unbeknownst to us, Bill hated financial printers, and he saw this as a way to put them out of business. So he said, okay, I like the idea, I'll support it.
However, none of them had built a business before, and quitting a high-paying, secure job at Xerox was not an easy feat, especially when they had a family and children who depended on their salary.
He said, oh, by the way, have either of you ever run a business? And we said, oh, no.
Bill understood their positions.
He said, well, fine, I'll hire a guy to help you write the business plan so I can raise the money, but don't worry about that.
Following weeks of late-night conversations, Warnock and Jesch finally made the call that would change their lives forever. In November 1982, after 3 long years at Xerox, they submitted their resignation documents and walked away from stable careers and world-class research positions to pursue risk and adventure. They worked day and night on their business plan, refining their brief, further exploring the market, and defining how PostScript could transform the future of digital publishing. And the final step was for both Charles and John to agree on a definitive name for the business. As Charles and John walked through a creek that ran behind both of their homes, trying to make sense of how their lives had changed so quickly, they got the idea of naming their company after something that felt personally meaningful to them. With an initial investment of $2.5 million from Hambrecht and Quist, Adobe Systems was officially founded on December 2, 1982. Just as the Adobe Creek where Charles and John used to go to reflect on their professional lives, the company's name reflected their desire to stay grounded and build something meaningful to them. Right from the get-go, their goal was to recreate a more advanced version of Interpress from scratch, a new programming language called PostScript, which also enabled computers to print documents exactly as they appeared on screen. As 1982 turned to 1983, the duo began hiring the most talented engineers and graphics specialists with the funds they had received, aiming to build an elite team that could drive their mission forward. By the third quarter of 1983, they hired their core technical team and had staff of around 10 full-time employees working out of a small office in Mountain View, California to finish PostScript. At this point, even though they only had a business plan and no product, word of mouth began spreading about what they were creating throughout Silicon Valley, with founders desperately wanting to buy their idea. Among the interested entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs was especially interested and invited Warnock and Jesch to Apple's headquarters for a private meeting.
He said, I would love to buy you guys. And we said, well, we just started. Too early. We don't want to do that.
There was an underlying reason why the duo wasn't keen on selling the business. For Warnock and Jesch, it wasn't just about the money. It was about creating something that empowered creators and gave people control over how their ideas looked on paper and on screen.
An engineer, a scientist, don't care which, dreams about coming up with something that millions of people will find valuable and use. That's what drives us. That's really what you want to do. That puts the stamp of importance on what you've achieved. And that's something that John and I and all the early people at Adobe have had the experience of, and it is by far the most gratifying thing.
Now with their mission statement in mind, the duo met with Steve Jobs once again to discuss an alternative way of working together. In a highly successful meeting, Adobe secured an extraordinary deal, a $2.5 million licensing fee upfront, plus a royalty on every printer Apple sold that included PostScript technology. For a company with no product just months earlier, achieving a deal like this was unheard of, but even if Warnock and Jesch couldn't believe it, this was just the start. In the summer of 1985, Apple dropped the product that would change the life of Warnock and Jesch forever, the LaserWriter. With PostScript embedded in its core printing engine, the LaserWriter was the first laser printer to reproduce complex page layouts accurately and print text and graphics exactly as they appeared on screen. Compared to laser printers that cost up to $250,000 just 5 years before, Apple's LaserWriter was released at a price of $6,995. In a shock to Xerox and the entire printing industry, the product was deemed revolutionary by tech enthusiasts, and practically overnight, Adobe's revenue and profit surged. In just 1 year, they went from zero revenue to over $1 million per month, expanded to more than 20 employees, and secured deals with every major computer company looking to catch up with Apple. In a single product launch, Adobe hadn't just entered the industry, they had created one from scratch and proven Xerox wrong in the boldest of fashions. Just 18 months after the release of the LaserWriter, Adobe had transformed from a quiet startup into one of the most talked about companies in Silicon Valley. From 1985 to 1986, they signed additional licensing deals with IBM, Canon, and HP, generating over $20 million in annual revenue and more than $4 million in profits from PostScript. For a company that had no product 2 years earlier, this was nothing short of extraordinary. To put things into perspective, Microsoft took 5 years to reach the same revenue milestone, and Apple 4 years to achieve the same profit. On the other hand, while the present was already outperforming every expectation, Wall Street's vision for Adobe was even more exciting. In 1986, Adobe went public with a valuation of over $200 million, becoming the first software company to have an IPO and achieve profitability in under 4 years. However, despite their early success and industry buzz, Charles Jesch and John Warnock were just getting started. To continue their mission of empowering everyday users with creative tools, the duo invested PostScript's profits in building more tools that enable people to bring their ideas to life visually.
This is a product that we are very, very excited about. It addresses the professional illustration market and it has a lot of capabilities that you won't find in other programs.
From January to March 1988, a small group of engineers developed Adobe Illustrator, a drawing program that enabled designers to create smooth, scalable graphics without compromising quality. Similar to PostScript's role with printers, this was the first program that allowed you to draw anything and resize it infinitely without looking blurry. Yet despite being one of the best graphic design products on the market, its earning potential had an even higher upside. Following their first deal with Steve Jobs, the two companies partnered again, agreeing that Illustrator would be developed exclusively for the Macintosh. This gave Adobe a direct line to millions of users and helped cement the Mac as the go-to computer for designers. As analysts expected, Illustrator quickly became the go-to tool for professional designers in just a few months, powering everything from magazine covers to corporate branding across the creative industry.
Now anyone can create high-quality graphics and illustrations, quickly and easily. Because today there's a revolution taking place in graphic design and production. A revolution born of computers and laser technology, but with its roots in the tradition of quality and creativity. A revolution based on new tools, tools which free the imagination and eliminate drudgery. Introducing Adobe Illustrator 88 from Adobe Systems.
While Illustrator's use cases continued to increase over time, Adobe's balance sheet saw its fastest growth since the launch of PostScript. After only a year of its anticipated release, Illustrator generated an additional $19 million in revenue for the company. At the same time Illustrator was on the rise, two brothers, Thomas and John Knoll, had taken inspiration from Adobe and quietly developed a powerful image editing tool in their spare time. They called it Display, and it was a graphic design software that allowed users to manipulate digital photos with a level of detail no one had seen before. Inspired by their earlier partnership with Steve Jobs, Adobe began looking beyond its walls for the next breakthrough. Rather than build a competing tool from scratch, Adobe licensed the software for $300,000, rebranded it as Photoshop, and took it to market in February 1990.
A picture may no longer be worth 1,000 words.
I see the computer is a wonderful tool for graphic artists, and I wouldn't live without it.
You can do this for $800 now. It used to cost $1 million 2 years ago.
So anybody can do it.
With a Macintosh and Photoshop, that's all you need.
By the end of the 1990s, Adobe's market capitalization had grown from $60 million in 1988 to over $3 billion in 1999. What was once a small startup in Mountain View had grown to over 2,000 employees and had a full suite of creative and professional tools that empowered its users. PostScript, Illustrator, Photoshop, Acrobat, Premiere, and After Effects. Each a category-defining product, generated a total of $176.5 million in annual profits for the American giant. At this point, Adobe had consolidated itself as one of the most valuable 500 companies in America, joining the prestigious S&P 500 index alongside tech giants such as Apple, Microsoft, and Intel. As the duo celebrated nearly 20 years since founding Adobe from their quiet homes in Los Altos, California, they took a moment to reflect on everything they had built and on the future that awaited them. Now in their early 60s, they had earned over $1 billion in personal profits, achieved the mission they had fought for so long, and had taken Adobe to the very elite of American business. Now it was time for them to take a more advisory role and let the next generation take the wheel. After 2 decades of leading Adobe in every decision, Warnock and Jesk stepped down from day-to-day operations in 2000 and 2001. In an internal ceremony, they were honoured by Adobe's employees, who in a big round of applause celebrated the incredible legacy they had built. Yet even though they would no longer be in the driver's seat, both would still remain as the chairman of the board of directors. Alongside 10 other executives from the world's largest software companies, their new role was to approve or decline any major decision made by their representatives. At Adobe's new office in San Jose, California, Bruce Chizen replaced Warnock as CEO and Shantanu Narayan replaced Jesk as president. From product strategy to marketing and pricing, They now led Adobe in every aspect of its daily operations. However, despite being highly experienced in their positions, they came from a world that was less about creator-first ideals and more about growth charts, licensing models, and quarterly performance. In the first decade of the new century, Adobe shifted its focus from innovation to integration, marking the start of an era where it packaged its products into larger and tightly controlled bundles. With the release of the Creative Suite in 2003, they decided to consolidate tools like Photoshop, Illustrator, and the new InDesign into a single, expensive package. Despite not being an exciting product for long-time users, the Creative Suite was an incredible success, bringing the company over $423 million in revenue and $123 million in net profit in just one quarter. Similarly, 2 years later, in 2005, Adobe acquired Macromedia, the creative powerhouse behind Flash and Dreamweaver, in a $3.4 billion deal that effectively eliminated its biggest rival. By 2010, with Shantanu Narayan as the CEO, Adobe continued its path of profits first, customers second, and acquired Omniture to expand its reach into cloud-based collaboration with its upcoming release of Acrobat.com.
We want to change the world and want to help change the world through digital experiences.
With a market capitalization of approximately $12.5 billion and profits exceeding $832 million in 2012, Adobe had become the undisputed leader in creative software, seemingly achieving a near monopoly status. However, just when some Wall Street analysts thought that Adobe was destined to stagnate after experiencing a remarkable 380% growth in the last decade, 2013 was about to change things forever. Adobe announced that it would discontinue the Creative Suite and transition entirely to the Creative Cloud, a subscription-only model that required users to pay monthly or annually to access the software. In an attempt to increase its profits by making the product more expensive in the long run, Adobe users expressed significant dissatisfaction. Shortly after the announcement, a petition titled "Eliminate the Mandatory Creative Cloud Subscription Mode" was signed by over 49,000 users. The petition accused the company of forcing a rental model and eliminating perpetual licenses. Users discovered that once they stopped paying for the subscription, they lost access to the rights of their work and were also hit with a hefty early termination fee of 50% of the remaining contract value.
I shouldn't be spending $600 a year on the thing that basically is doing the exact same thing for me as it did in all previous versions.
However, despite backlash from its core audience, the Creative Cloud was deemed a financial goldmine, and it quickly became Adobe's most profitable product by a factor of tenfold. Over the next 5 years, the new subscription model gained over 12 million subscribers, propelling Adobe's market capitalization from $17.41 billion in 2013 to $91.93 billion by the end of 2017, a mind-boggling 428% increase. With a strong product lineup and a growing customer base, it was now considered one of the top 100 most prominent companies in the United States. However, amidst significant leadership transition and a core change in the principles on which the company was founded, both Warnock and Jesch decided to step down as chairman of the board in their mid-70s. At this point in their lives, they had accomplished everything they once dreamed of, empowered millions of creators worldwide, secured their legacy in Silicon Valley, and watched the company they started amid chaos and rejection become one of the most successful in the world. As a result, after a period of reflection, they decided to retire entirely from the board to spend the rest of their lives with their families and children. This meant that for the first time, Adobe was no longer guided by its original visionaries. Instead, corporate strategists and Wall Street executives now held complete control over the dark future that lay ahead for the company. In business, it is very common for companies to drift when founders step back entirely, slowly abandoning the values that once made them great and becoming increasingly greedy. As loyalty and love for the mission fade, incentives continue to rise. Although signs of this phenomenon had already begun for Adobe with the introduction of the Creative Cloud, The years that followed would take this premise to the next level. With Warnock and Jesk retired from the board in 2017, Adobe was heavily criticized for focusing almost exclusively on its flagship products and leaving the rest of its creative ecosystem to stagnate. While Photoshop, Illustrator, and Premiere Pro received consistent updates and marketing, other products, such as Adobe Fireworks, Muse, and Flash Professional, were plagued by bugs and performance issues.
Back in June of last year, news stories started to come out about how Adobe was putting XD on life support.
I don't think Adobe's doing the best job of explaining this to us.
I can't believe people still use this.
Similarly, in 2019, Adobe began sending emails to Creative Cloud users, warning them that continuing to use older versions of its software could result in legal action if they did not upgrade to the latest versions. If that weren't enough, at the start of 2021, the backlash against Adobe reached an all-time high when outrage users exposed the company's early cancellation fees after a user posted on social media that Adobe was charging him over $250 for simply cancelling his subscriptions.
So there's been this tweet that's been floating around the internet over the last day or so where someone was charged $291 to cancel their Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. That is a lot.
All over the internet, customer complaints and viral threads accuse the company of predatory practices and exploiting its monopoly power. While Adobe faced rising pressure from its user base, unexpected news arrived at the company's headquarters. Both Charles Jesk and John Warnock had been diagnosed with cancer, and whether they had a lot more to live was uncertain. Even though they had retired from their roles and stepped away from public life, they still made occasional appearances at speaking events, universities, and tech conferences, often reflecting on the early days of Adobe and offering advice to young entrepreneurs.
I thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Unfortunately, in April 2021, Charles Jesk succumbed to pancreatic cancer at the age of 81 in Los Altos, California.
I don't deal with rules well or standard ways of doing things. And I've never been great at dealing with authority of people telling me that you can't do that because of something or you can't do this because of something.
Adobe co-founder Dr. John Warnock died this weekend at the age of 82.
Only 2 years later, in August 2023, John Warnock passed away in California at the age of 82, also due to cancer. Sadly, the Adobe founders who once championed creativity and customer empowerment were gone. Now, with a board that wasn't bound by the original founders' ideals in any shape or form, Adobe had completely lost the soul that once inspired and served creators, both physically and metaphorically. And what was going to happen next was a reflection of this shift. In 2024, as the AI craze swept across the tech industry, Adobe faced intense backlash over its AI data policies. According to the terms of service found in their newly introduced Firefly and its generative AI models, it was explicitly stated that users granted Adobe a worldwide license to access, use, and analyze their content. In other words, the company was openly admitting that it had the right to own the content created by its users and use the data to train and develop its own AI models. As if that weren't enough, the Adobe stock ecosystem, which had been the source of income for thousands of independent photographers, illustrators, and motion artists, was entirely replaced with AI-generated alternatives trained on user-uploaded data.
Last week, Adobe updated their Creative Cloud terms of service, and boy, did it not go well.
Adobe recently updated their terms of service with the default setting that uses your artwork in order to help train their AI.
That is not my brand anymore. You've polluted and diluted it, and I think we should be alarmed at this.
At this point, the backlash against Adobe had become so intense that the Federal Trade Commission filed a federal lawsuit against Adobe for allegedly hiding cancellation fees and making it deliberately difficult for users to cancel their subscriptions.
The Federal Trade Commission is accusing software company Adobe of deceiving its customers.
They make subscriptions easy to buy, but extremely difficult to cancel.
On the other hand, for the first time in its history, Wall Street analysts downgraded Adobe's stock after the company failed to turn its AI hype into real profits, resulting in a drop of about 35% since its all-time high in November 2021.
Adobe is the worst performing stock in the S&P and the NASDAQ 100 today.
However, despite all the backlash from its community, Adobe responded by increasing the price of its subscription model from $59.99 to $69.99 per month for annual subscribers in 2025, reaffirming that profit still comes first and customers second.
Adobe introduced a price increase.
People hate Adobe now.
I have severed all ties with Adobe.
Adobe are kinda evil.
What began as a tool for creative freedom, created from a place of genuine passion and respect for artists, has, without a doubt, become the symbol of corporate greed. And whether the company will one day return to the mission that Warnock and Jesk laid out back in 1982 is a story that may never be told.